They named the place Hawthorne Falls because it sounded like home, like porches and Sunday barbecues, and people who borrowed sugar and returned it. I moved here for the trees and a mortgage I could stomach, not for neighborhood drama. So when packages started vanishing from my porch, I told myself it was a fluke, one of those little thefts you read about. Then I watched the same woman walk up my steps on camera, calm as if she owned every stoop, and everything changed. Her name was Margot Whitfield, and she had a yard that could be in a magazine, trimmed hedges, a mailbox that stood like a miniature monument. She wore a smile like a practiced woman wears pearls, polite at festivals and surgical in private. When I saw her on my door cam, slipping a box into the trunk of her car, I felt that strange, hot mix of disbelief and clarity, the kind that makes you do things you wouldn't normally do on a Tuesday morning. So I set a trap. Not because I wanted revenge. Exactly, at first it was curiosity, a push to know whether the camera was lying, but when she walked up and took it, I couldn't help it. I rigged the box with bright washable dye, watching her curse and flail as neon pink smeared her coat and the inside of her car, watching the perfect lawn neighbor become a ridiculous headline in our cul-de-sac. I felt that guilty little victory you get when a bully trips. The street laughed. Phones came out. For a moment, the air tasted like vindication. The community board, the people who run everything from parking rules to who gets to plant azaleas, saw something else. They fined me for improper parcel deterrence. I showed them the footage. They showed me the bylaw that made a paint prank my fault. They patted Margot on the shoulder like she was a victim. That was when the game changed. Small, petty things started happening. My cable line was sliced one morning, so every show quit mid-episode. My sprinkler schedule got flipped, so packages sat soaking on the porch. Someone left a flyer on my door with my name circled and ugly suggestions about neighborhood standards. I tried the civil route. I went to meetings, I filed complaints, I walked over with coffee, because confrontation has never been my style. Margot had a way of turning smiles into stories, of making complicated things seem like misunderstandings. At a board meeting, she asked, soft as a hymn, whether someone had been staging incidents to cause trouble, and half the room nodded because she'd already told them a version of the story that made her mistake sound noble. It felt like arguing with a mirror. Everything I presented came back softened, reframed, as if the camera footage was a prank and her outrage was the real injury. I've always believed in keeping records long before anyone called them evidence. I started timing the camera angles, making sure the timestamps were clear, learning what night light leaked into the lens. I talked to neighbors in ways that didn't feel like gossip, just facts, names, odd occurrences. Mr. Nguyen had a dented mailbox. Mrs. Calloway's bird feeder disappeared 3 times in 1 month. The teenager across the street found mean notes on his car. People had been embarrassed into silence. Others had felt powerless. The stories added up. Then came the day Margot showed up with a rented excavator. I know how absurd that sounds, like a headline you'd swipe past, but that's what made it terrifying. She drove that thing through my fenced yard, tore the edge of the property into a mess, uprooted the flower bed my late grandmother planted. Neighbors poured into their lawns with phones raised, recorder apps blinking like stars. I had my camera rolling. She had her fury in 3 dimensions. I went out and stood in the driveway while dirt rained down and tried to find the human behind the machine. "Why are you doing this?" I said. It was simple. I didn't want a speech. I wanted a human answer. "Because someone has to keep things in order," she snapped. "Because people get lax. Because if you let one person start a circus, the whole place falls apart." There was a cruelty in that wasn't about lawns at all. It was about power, and a person who'd made being the arbiter of rightness into a profession. The police came the next day because of the calls, and for once the footage mattered. It refused to be rewritten over casual smiles. The community board couldn't both fine me for a prank and neatly ignore a woman who brought construction equipment to destroy private property. Paper has a way of making people choose sides. Margot's escalation had reasons that made a grim kind of sense. She'd been on that board for years, the voice in the minutes who liked her name in print. My prank had threatened that. It suggested her neat life wasn't bulletproof. Pride is terrible under pressure. It shrinks, it claws. She doubled down. And the things she did after felt like reactions from someone trying to snap a rope taut before anyone else could pull. We tried mediation, which basically means 3 people in a room talking in circles while the real damage happens outside. She filed a lawsuit accusing me of harassment. I filed a countersuit when the excavator left a trench that cost more than I could afford. Lawyers used words like vexatious and damages and discovery, which sounds boring until you have to pay for it. I wasn't trying to make money. I was trying to make a record to make it so, when someone read the paper, the story had both angles. The night a mailbox smoldered and sent smoke drifting past porch lights is when people started to see a pattern as a pattern. Not a big cinematic fire, but enough heat and enough char to make the neighborhood wake up and ask whether small cruelties were growing into something dangerous. Someone drove through with a hose and stamped out the embers. Sheriff cars came. For the first time, someone asked me if I was afraid. I said I was not just because of the arson, but because of the exhaustion of having to explain that being visible sometimes makes you a target. Court days are strange. You sit in a room of polished wood and watch strangers in suits hand you pages of your life. Her lawyer called me a vigilante. My lawyer smiled a tired smile and handed over a drive with 3 months of footage. When the images play in front of a judge, emotions flatten into facts. The judge didn't have the luxury of feeling loyalties. The account was settled, she paid damages. The HOA agreed to clearer procedures before punishing someone for trying to protect their property, and the community board had to admit, on paper at least, they had been hasty to dismiss concerns. Margot moved out a few months later. She sold the house to a young couple who painted the shutters a color I'd never seen before, the kind of color that pretends a fresh start is simple. Change came, quiet and messy. The yard got fixed. The community meetings started to include minutes that actually mattered. But endings are never neat. People whispered about who was right and who was wrong, and for weeks some lamented that the board had lost its most vocal guardian of standards. What stayed with me wasn't the courtroom or the paint or the noise of an excavator. It was the way neighbors looked at one another afterward, like people who've learned not to assume the face in front of them matches the story in their head. Small acts of decency, like collecting a neighbor's package when they're out of town, became choices people noticed again. You can forgive, you can confront, you can record. None of those options are automatically righteous. They just have consequences. So here's where you come and bring your stories. Have you ever watched someone smile while they broke trust? Have you ever stood on a porch, hand hovering over the door, wondering whether to knock or to film? Drop a comment below. Tell me which side of the fence you'd have stood on, and share this with someone who lives on a street that looks perfect from the sidewalk. If you want more of these small-town confessions that get uglier than you'd expect, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.